The wind cut like a blade across the frozen plains of Vector 7, and young Kale struggled to keep up with his pack. He was small for his age, barely 7 years old by human counting, and his legs were shorter than the others in the hunting party. But he pushed himself forward because that was what a Varathi did. And weakness was not something his people tolerated. The Varathi were proud creatures, standing 7 feet tall when fully grown, covered in thick silver fur that protected them from the harsh winters of their colony world. And their eyes burned like molten copper in the pale light of the twin suns that hung low on the horizon. Kale's pack numbered 12 strong hunters, led by Theron, a massive warrior whose scars told stories of 100 successful hunts and whose voice commanded absolute obedience from every member of the group. They were tracking a herd of ice elk through the canyonlands, and the hunt had been going well until the weather turned bad and the snow began falling. Harder than anyone had expected. Kale's mother had died during his birth, and his father had fallen in battle 2 seasons ago, leaving the young cub to survive on the scraps of kindness that the pack occasionally threw his way, which was never much because the Varathi did not believe in charity. He had learned early that he had to earn his place, that every meal was a reward for contribution, and that those who could not contribute did not eat. The canyon walls rose high on either side of the hunting party, ancient stone carved by wind and ice over thousands of years. And Kale felt a strange unease as he looked up at the unstable rocks that hung above them, like teeth waiting to bite down. He wanted to say something, wanted to warn the others, but young cubs did not speak unless spoken to. And so he kept his mouth shut and kept moving forward. The sound came first, a deep rumbling that started somewhere far above and grew louder with every heartbeat. And then the rocks began to fall. Kale saw the others scatter, their powerful legs carrying them forward and out of danger with the speed and grace that made the Varathi such feared predators across a dozen worlds. But his own legs were not as fast, and when he tried to run, his foot caught on a loose stone and he fell. The first rock struck his hind leg, and he heard the bone snap before he felt the pain. A wet cracking sound that seemed impossibly loud, even over the thunder of the rock slide, screamed then. A high and terrible sound that echoed off the canyon walls. And he tried to crawl forward, tried to drag himself to safety. But then another rock struck his back and everything went white with agony when the rumbling finally stopped, and the dust began to settle. Kale found himself lying in a pool of his own blood, his leg bent at an angle that made his stomach churn, and he could not feel anything below his waist. He whimpered and called out for his pack, his voice weak and broken, and for a long time there was only silence. Then he heard footsteps, the familiar crunch of Varathi paws on frozen ground, and hope flared in his chest like a small flame struggling against the windpack. Leader Theron appeared above him, looking down with those burning copper eyes. And for a moment, Kale thought everything would be okay, thought that the pack would carry him back to the settlement and the healers would fix his broken body. But then he saw the look in Theron's eyes, and the hope died as quickly as it had come. There was no warmth there, no concern, no love. Only the cold calculation of a predator assessing whether prey was worth the effort of the kill. "Please," Kale whispered, reaching up with one trembling paw. "Please help me." Theron looked at the broken leg, at the blood staining the snow, at the young cub who could not move and could not hunt and could not contribute anything to the pack's survival, and then he spoke the words that Kale had heard, whispered about others, but never thought he would hear spoken over himself. "The weak return to the frost," Theron said, his voice flat and ritual and completely without emotion. "The strong carry the hunt forward." "No," Kale begged, tears freezing on his fur. "No, please. I can get better. I can heal. Please do not leave me here." But Theron had already turned away, and one by one the other hunters followed. Not one of them looking back at the broken cub lying in the snow. Kale watched them go, watched the silver shapes of his pack grow smaller and smaller against the white landscape until they disappeared over the ridge and he was completely alone. The cold was getting worse, seeping into his bones, and he could feel his body starting to shut down. Could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. He was going to die here, alone and abandoned, and no one would ever know or care. This was the Vorathi way, the tradition that had guided his people for 10,000 years. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that he was supposed to accept this, supposed to embrace the frost and let his spirit return to the great hunt in the sky. But he was 7 years old, and he was scared, and he did not want to die. He howled then, one long and desperate cry that carried across the frozen wasteland, a sound of pure grief and terror and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might hear him and come. But the only answer was the wind, cold and uncaring, and eventually even his howl faded into silence. Kale lay there in the snow, watching the pale light of the twin suns sink toward the horizon. And he thought about his mother whom he had never known, and his father whom he barely remembered, and all the years he would never get to live. The blood had stopped flowing now, frozen solid against his fur, and he could no longer feel the pain, which he knew was a bad sign. Knew that his body was giving up even if his mind was not ready to let go. He closed his eyes and waited for death to come. He was still waiting when the strange sound reached his ears. A humming and mechanical noise unlike anything he had heard before. And he forced his eyes open one more time to see a strange metal shape descending from the sky. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was a furless face looking down at him, soft and strange and filled with something he did not recognize. And then there was nothing at all. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been on Vector 7 for 3 years, studying the mineral deposits that made this frozen world so valuable to the colony program. And in all that time, she had learned to expect the unexpected, but she had not expected this. The ground vehicle sensors had picked up the heat signature about 2 kilometers from the canyon. A faint blip that was fading fast, and her assistant Marcus Chen had suggested they ignore it because they were already behind schedule, and the storm was getting worse. Elena had almost agreed, almost turned the vehicle around and headed back to the outpost. But something made her hesitate. It could be an injured animal, she said, squinting at the sensor readout, or a crashed drone, or maybe nothing at all. Or it could be trouble, Marcus replied. But he was already changing course because he had worked with Elena long enough to know that she was going to investigate whether he agreed or not. They found the cub half buried in snow, a small silver shape that looked almost peaceful until they got close enough to see the blood and the broken bones, and the way his chest was barely moving. That is a Vorathi, Marcus said, his voice tight with sudden fear. Elena, we cannot get involved in this. You know what they are like. You know how they feel about humans interfering in their affairs. Elena was already out of the vehicle, kneeling in the snow beside the broken child, her hands moving quickly to check for vital signs. He is alive, she said. Barely, but alive. He is Vorathi, Marcus repeated. They have rules about this kind of thing. They leave their weak to die. It is part of their culture. If we take him, they could see it as an insult, as an attack on their traditions. Elena looked up at her assistant, her dark eyes hard and determined in a way that Marcus had learned to recognize as the end of any argument. He is a child, she said simply, and I am not going to let a child die in the snow because of politics. She was already calling for emergency medevac before Marcus could say another word, her voice calm and professional, even as her hands worked to stabilize the cub's broken body. The medical team arrived 20 minutes later, and by then, Elena had done what she could with the basic supplies in the vehicle, wrapping the cub in thermal blankets and trying to slow the bleeding from wounds that should have killed him hours ago. He should be dead, the medic said as they loaded the small body onto the transport. I do not understand how he is still breathing, Varathi are tough, Elena replied, climbing into the transport beside her patient. Now let us see if we can keep him that way. The outpost medical bay was small and basic, designed to handle human injuries and minor emergencies, not the catastrophic trauma of an alien species that no one on the team had ever treated before. Elena worked through the night, pulling up every database she could find on Varathi physiology, making educated guesses when the data was incomplete, and improvising solutions when none existed. The cub's leg was shattered in 3 places, the bone fragments scattered like broken glass beneath his silver fur, and his spine had suffered damage that would require equipment and expertise far beyond what the outpost could provide. His blood was not quite right for any of the synthetic supplies they had on hand. So Elena spent 2 hours modifying a clotting agent to match his biology, testing small samples until she found something that worked. When his heart stopped at 3 in the morning, she shocked it back to rhythm with a defibrillator she had jury-rigged to work with his alien nervous system. And when he started seizing an hour later, she held him down with her own body while Marcus injected sedatives that she prayed would not kill him by dawn. The cub was stable, he was not healthy, and he was not out of danger, but he was alive. And for Elena, that was enough. Marcus found her sitting beside the medical bed, holding the cub's paw in her hand. And he had never seen her look so tired or so determined at the same time. The Varathi Council is going to be furious, he said quietly. They will say we overstepped. They will say we violated their sovereignty. They will say we had no right to interfere. Probably, Elena agreed, not taking her eyes off her patient. This could damage relations between our species for years. Maybe. This could end your career. Elena finally looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that Marcus had never seen before. Something fierce and protective and absolutely certain. His pack left him to die, she said. A child Marcus, 7 years old at most. And they walked away from him like he was garbage, like he did not matter, like his life had no value because he could not hunt or fight or contribute to their precious survival of the fittest. Philosophy. She squeezed the cub's paw gently, feeling the warmth of life still pulsing beneath the silver fur. I do not care about politics, she continued. I do not care about diplomatic relations. I do not care about my career, because none of that matters compared to this one simple fact. There was a child dying in the snow, and I could help him. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking at the small broken body on the medical bed. And finally he nodded. What do you need me to do? He asked. Elena smiled. The first genuine smile she had managed since they found the cub in the canyon. I need you to help me figure out how to fix a broken spine with spare parts and good intentions, she said. And maybe make some soup, because when this little one wakes up, he's going to be hungry. Marcus laughed despite himself and went to find the xenobiology manuals and the emergency ration supplies. And Elena stayed beside the bed, holding the paw of a child who had been abandoned by everyone who should have loved him. She did not know his name or his story or what his future would hold. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to let him die. Not ever. Not as long as she had breath in her body and strength in her hands, because that was what humans did for children, any children. Regardless of species or politics or the cold calculations of survival, they fought for them, they loved them, and they never, ever left them alone in the snow. Cale woke expecting to find himself in the cold embrace of death, surrounded by the spirits of his ancestors in the great hunting grounds that the Varathi believed waited for them beyond the final breath. Instead, he found warmth. He blinked, his copper eyes open slowly, confused by the soft light and the strange humming sounds and the weight of blankets that covered his broken body. And for a long moment, he could not understand where he was or how he had gotten there. Then the memories came flooding back. The rock slide and the pain and the terrible words of pack leader Theron and the long cold hours waiting to die in the snow. and he whimpered softly because he did not understand why he was still alive. A face appeared above him, furless and strange, and nothing like any creature he had ever seen before, with dark eyes and dark hair, and skin the color of warm earth. "Hey there," the creature said in a voice that was somehow both soft and strong at the same time. "Welcome back, little one. You had us worried for a while." Kale tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw, and all that came out was a weak croaking sound that made the furless creature frown with concern. "Here," she said, lifting a container to his lips. "Drink this, slowly now. Small sips." The liquid was warm and sweet, and unlike anything Kale had ever tasted, and it soothed his throat and filled his belly with a gentle heat that spread through his entire body. "My name is Elena," the creature said. "I am a human. Do you know what humans are?" Kale nodded weakly because he had heard stories about the strange furless beings who had come to Vector 7 a generation ago. Soft creatures who lived in metal boxes and could not survive in the cold without their machines and their artificial shelters. His people did not think much of humans, considered them weak and useless, barely worth noticing. "You were hurt very badly," Elena continued, sitting down beside his bed. "Your leg was broken and your back was damaged. We did what we could, but you are going to need more help than we can give you here." "Why?" Kale managed to whisper, the words scraping past his damaged throat. Elena tilted her head, confused by the question. "Why what? Why did you help me?" Kale asked. "I am broken. I am useless. I cannot hunt or fight or do anything valuable. Why would you waste your resources on me?" The expression that crossed Elena's face was something Kale had never seen before. A mixture of sadness and anger and something else. Something warm that he could not identify. "Because you needed help," she said simply. "That is all. That is enough." Kale stared at her, trying to make sense of her words, trying to fit them into everything he had been taught about the way the world worked, that the weak must die so the strong can survive. He said, repeating the lesson that had been drilled into him since he was old enough to understand words. "That is the way of things. That is the natural order." Elena reached out and took his paw in her hand, her furless fingers warm and gentle against his fur. "Maybe that is the Varathi way," she said, "but it is not the human way. And as long as you are in my care, you will live by human rules." Over the following weeks, Kale learned what those rules meant. He learned that humans did not leave their wounded behind, that they carried them and cared for them and spent time and resources on beings who could not contribute anything in return. He learned that Elena would sit beside his bed for hours, talking to him about her homeworld and her family and her dreams for the future. Even though he could offer nothing back except silent attention, he learned that Marcus, Elena's assistant, would read to him from human adventure stories, doing ridiculous voices for the different characters that made. Kale laughed despite the pain that still throbbed through his broken body. He learned that Yuki, the gruff engineer who maintained the outpost's equipment, had built him a leg brace from spare parts, and then rebuilt it 3 more times because she was not satisfied with the balance. "If you're going to walk," Yuki said, making adjustments to the metal framework that wrapped around his shattered limb, "you are going to walk properly. I am not having you stumble around like a broken toy because I did not get the calibration right." He learned that humans argued with each other constantly about the best way to help him, about what foods would be good for his recovery, and what exercises would strengthen his damaged muscles, and what stories would keep his spirits high during the long days of healing. He learned that they did all of this without expecting anything in return, without keeping score, without calculating whether he was worth the effort. One night, after a particularly painful physical therapy session that had left him exhausted and frustrated, Kale asked Elena the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment he woke up in her care. "I do not understand you," he said, his copper eyes searching her face for answers. "My people would have left me to die. And that makes sense because I cannot help them and I would only slow them down. But you do not think that way, and I do not understand why. Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same seriousness she brought to everything. When I was a little girl, she said finally, I got very sick. So sick that the doctors were not sure I would survive. And my parents spent everything they had trying to save me. Every credit, every resource, every moment of their lives for almost a year. Did you survive? Cale asked, though the answer was obvious. I did. Elena smiled. But that is not the point. The point is that when I asked my mother why they did not give up, why they kept fighting for me when I was too weak to do anything for myself, she told me something I have never forgotten. What did she say? Elena squeezed his paw gently. She said that love is not something you earn by being useful. Love is something you give because giving it makes you more than you were before. And the moment you start calculating whether someone is worth loving, you have already lost the most important part of yourself. Cale felt something shift inside him. Something that had been frozen solid since the moment Theron spoke the right of release over his broken body. I have never been loved like that, he whispered. Elena leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his in a gesture that felt strangely natural despite how alien she was. You are now, she said. You are ours, Cale, whether you want to be or not. And humans do not give up on family. For the first time since the rock slide, Cale felt tears running down his face, hot and wet and full of an emotion he could not name, but this time, they were not tears of grief. They were tears of hope. 3 months after the rock slide, a human delegation arrived at the Varathi capital city to return the cub, who should have died in the snowcale, stood between Elena and Marcus, his new cybernetic leg brace gleaming in the cold light of the twin suns. And he tried not to shake as they approached the great stone hall where the Varathi Council waited to receive them. He was stronger now than he had been on that terrible day in the canyon. His body healed as much as it was ever going to heal. And the humans had given him something more valuable than physical recovery. They had given him a new way of seeing the world, but standing here, surrounded by his own people, for the first time since his abandonment, Cale felt all of his old fears rushing back like a flood that threatened to sweep away everything he had learned. The council chamber was vast and ancient, carved from the bones of the mountain itself, and the 5 elders who ruled the Varathi sat on thrones of polished ice that had not melted in 10,000 years. Pack leader Theron stood among them, his copper eyes cold and distant when they fell upon the cub he had left to die. You have something that belongs to us, the High Elder said, his voice echoing off the frozen walls. We have come to discuss its return. Elena stepped forward, her small human body dwarfed by the massive Varathi warriors who surrounded her. But her voice was steady and strong. Cale was found injured and alone in the canyon, she said. We provided medical care, and he has recovered. We are here to reunite him with his pack. The High Elder turned to Theron, pack leader. Will you reclaim this cub? Theron looked at Cale for a long moment, taking in the cybernetic brace and the way the young one stood straight and tall despite his injuries. And then he shook his massive head. No, he said. The cub was released to the frost according to our traditions. He is no longer part of my pack. But he survived, Marcus protested. He recovered. Surely that proves his worth. He survived because of human interference, Theron replied, his voice thick with contempt. He is tainted now, touched by your weakness, your sentiment, your pathetic refusal to accept the natural order. Taking him back would pollute our strength. Cale felt the words like a physical blow, felt all of his old shame and self-hatred rising up inside him. But then he felt Elena's hand on his shoulder, warm and steady and absolutely certain. Then, what would you have us do with him? Elena asked, her voice calm despite the anger that Cale could see burning in her eyes. The High Elder spread his massive paws in a gesture of indifference. That is not our concern. You chose to interfere. You chose to save what should have been allowed to die. The consequences of that choice are yours to bear. So you are just going to abandon him again. Marcus said, a child of your own species. And you are going to throw him away like garbage. We are going to follow our traditions. The High Elder replied, as we have for 10,000 years. The weak cannot be allowed to burden the strong. That is the law of survival. That is the truth that has made us the dominant species on 100 worlds. Elena looked at the council, at the cold faces and the colder hearts, and something in her expression shifted from anger to something harder. Something that made even the Varathi elders uncomfortable. Then he stays with us, she said. The chamber went silent. What did you say? The High Elder asked, leaning forward on his throne of ice. I said he stays with us, Elena repeated. If you do not want him, we will take him. He will live with humans, be raised by humans. Grow up as one of us? That is absurd, Theron snarled. He is not your species. He cannot work like you, cannot contribute like you. He will be a burden on your resources for years, perhaps for his entire life. Why would you keep him? Elena turned to face the pack leader who had abandoned a child in the snow. And her voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire chamber like the toll of a great bell. Because he is ours now, she said. And humans do not throw away family. The Varathi elders exchanged glances, and Kale could see that they were genuinely confused, genuinely unable to understand why any species would choose to care for a broken child who could offer nothing in return. This makes no sense, the High Elder said finally. You gain nothing from this arrangement. You only take on a burden that will slow you down, that will consume resources you could use for your own people. There must be something you want in exchange. There is nothing, Elena replied. I do not want payment. I do not want favors. I do not want anything except for you to understand that there are other ways of living besides the cold calculation of who is useful and who is not. She turned to look at Kale, and her eyes were bright with tears that she refused to let fall. This child was dying alone in the snow, and I saved him because that is what humans do. We save people. We carry each other. We fight for the ones who cannot fight for themselves, not because we expect something in return, but because doing so is what makes us human. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and then the High Elder rose from his throne. Take him then, he said. Take your burden and go. And when your resources are depleted and your people grow tired of caring for something that gives nothing back, remember that you chose this foolishness. Elena nodded and turned to leave, her hand still resting on Kale's shoulder, and Marcus fell into step beside them. They were almost at the door when Kale stopped. He turned back to face the council, to face Theron, to face all of the cold and ancient traditions that had nearly killed him. And he spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. You left me to die, he said, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his stomach. You looked at me and decided I was not worth saving, and you walked away. And I thought that was the end of my story. He stood straighter, feeling the strength of his new leg beneath him, feeling the warmth of the humans who had chosen him when his own people had thrown him away. But it was not the end. He continued. It was just the beginning, because these humans, these soft and furless creatures that you think are weak, they looked at me and saw something worth fighting for. They gave me a home when I had none. They gave me hope when I had given up. They gave me a family when my own family abandoned me. His copper eyes met Theron's cold gaze. You think caring for the weak makes them lesser, Kale said. But you are wrong. It makes them stronger than you will ever understand. He turned and walked out of the chamber, his metal leg clicking against the stone floor. And Elena and Marcus walked beside him like an honor guard behind them. The Varathi Council sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of a child who should have died in the snow, but had somehow found something more powerful than survival. They did not understand it, but Kale did, and as he stepped out into the cold sunlight of Vector 7, surrounded by the humans who had become his family, he knew that he would never be alone again. 15 years had passed since a broken cub was carried out of the Varathi capital by a small group of humans who refused to let him be thrown away. Kale stood now at the podium of the Galactic Interspecies Council, a towering figure of silver fur and burning copper eyes, his cybernetic leg gleaming beneath the bright lights of the assembly chamber. Behind him sat Elena, her dark hair now streaked with gray, but her eyes still bright with the same fierce determination that had saved his life all those years ago. And beside her Marcus and Yuki, older now but still watching over him like they had done since the day they found him dying in the snow. The chamber was filled with representatives from 100 different species, diplomats and leaders and observers who had come to witness what they had been told would be a historic moment. Kale looked out at the sea of alien faces and felt a calm certainty settle over him, because he knew exactly what he needed to say. Knew it in his bones the way he knew the warmth of Elena's hand and the sound of Marcus's laughter and the gruff affection in Yuki's voice. "My name is Kale," he began, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "And 15 years ago, I was left to die in the snow by my own people." A murmur ran through the assembly, and Kale waited for it to fade before continuing. "I was 7 years old, a child with a broken leg and a damaged spine. And according to the traditions of the Varathi, I was worthless, a burden, something to be discarded so that the strong could continue without being slowed down by my weakness." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My pack leader spoke the rite of release over my body and walked away, and I lay in the snow waiting to die. Because that was what I had been taught to do. That was what my culture demanded. And I was too young and too broken to imagine any other way." His copper eyes found Elena in the crowd, but then the humans came. The chamber grew very quiet. They found me dying, and they should have left me there, because I was not their species, not their responsibility, not their burden to carry. By every logical measure, they should have walked away just like my pack did, just like any rational being would have done. Kale's voice grew stronger, filled with an emotion that made several of the assembled diplomats lean forward in their seats. "But humans are not purely rational," he said. "They are something far more powerful than that. Something that my people had forgotten was even possible. Something that has the power to change everything we think we know about survival and strength, and what it means to be truly alive." He spread his arms wide, his cybernetic leg gleaming in the light. "They are kind." The word hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a human scientist with no obligation to me whatsoever, worked through the night to save my life. She used equipment that was not designed for my species. She improvised solutions when none existed. She held my paw when I woke screaming and spoke to me in soft words until I fell asleep again. He gestured to Marcus. Marcus Chun read me stories when I was too weak to do anything except lie in bed. He did ridiculous voices for the characters because he knew it would make me laugh. And laughter was the medicine I needed most. He turned to Yuki Tanaka, the gruff engineer who pretended she did not care about anything. Built me a leg brace from spare parts and then rebuilt it 4 times because she refused to let me walk badly. His voice softened. They gave me everything, and they asked for nothing in return. Because that is what humans do. That is what they have always done. And that is what my people could not understand. Kale looked out at the assembly, at the 100 different species watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to confusion to something that might have been hope. The Varathi believe that strength comes from culling the weak, he said. We believe that compassion is a luxury that survival cannot afford. We believe that caring for those who cannot contribute is a waste of resources that will eventually destroy any civilization foolish enough to practice it. He shook his head. We were wrong. The murmur that ran through the chamber was louder this time, and Kale raised his voice to speak over it. The humans are not the most physically powerful species in the galaxy. They are not the fastest or the strongest or the most technologically advanced. By the cold calculations of survival, they should have been conquered or destroyed long ago. His copper eyes blazed with conviction. But they have done something that no other species has managed. They have built alliances that span hundreds of worlds. They have turned enemies into friends and strangers into family. They have created a coalition of species that work together, not because they are forced to, but because they want to. Because the humans made them feel valued and cared for and important. He stepped out from behind the podium, his metal leg clicking against the floor. They did this by being kind, by helping those who needed help without asking for payment, by carrying the wounded instead of leaving them behind, by looking at a broken cub in the snow and seeing something worth saving. Kale turned to face his human family, and his voice cracked with emotion. They did this by loving me when I had nothing to offer. When I was useless and broken and convinced that I deserved to die, they loved me anyway. And that love transformed me from a discarded piece of garbage into the person standing before you today. He turned back to the assembly. I am here as the first Vorathi, ambassador to formally request integration with the human coalition. Not because we have been conquered, not because we have been forced, but because I have seen what kindness can do. I have lived it. I have been transformed by it. And I want my people to have that same chance. His voice rose until it filled the entire chamber. The humans are coming. Not with weapons, not with threats, not with the cold calculation of conquest. They are coming with open hands and warm fires, and the mad and stubborn belief that no one should ever die alone in the cold. He paused, letting the silence stretch. My people called that weakness. Another pause. I call it the future. The chamber erupted in sound. 100 different species, all talking at once. But Kale was not listening anymore. He was walking back to his family. To Elena, who was crying openly now. To Marcus, who was grinning like a fool. To Yuki, who was pretending that she had something in her eye. They gathered around him and held him close. And Kale felt the warmth of their love surrounding him like a blanket against the cold. I am proud of you, Elena whispered into his fur. I am so proud of the man you have become. Kale closed his copper eyes and let himself be held by the people who had chosen him when no one else would. I am who I am because of you, he said softly. Because you found me dying in the snow and decided that I was worth saving. Because you taught me that love is not something you earn by being useful. Because you never gave up on me, even when I had given up on myself. He pulled back and looked at each of them in turn. These strange, furless creatures who have become his family. Thank you, he said. For everything. Elena smiled and reached up to touch his face. That is what family does, she said simply. Now come on, we have a lot of work ahead of us. Changing the galaxy is not going to be easy. Kale laughed. And the sound echoed through the chamber, like a promise of things to come, a promise of kindness, a promise of hope, a promise that no child would ever be left alone in the snow again. Not if humans had anything to say about it.